So I'm Dr. Jennifer Jackson. I'm a registered nurse, and this is a video about interviewing. So I'm going to talk about broad principles and approaches to doing interviews. If you're doing research interviews, you're going to need to customize based on the methodology you're using, the population, place, all those kinds of things. But these are some general ideas that can help set you up for success. So, interviewing can be a very intimidating thing to do as a researcher, but it's best approached with curiosity. Often with a project, you've done a lot of work in the run up to an interview, and the interview is supposed to be the fun part. So, as much as the first couple, you're always a little nervous about like, how am I going to ask the questions? How are things going to go? Um, it's important to just try and say like, what can I learn from this person? What stories can they share with me? And how can we have like a good interaction here? And so setting yourself up that way hopefully will lead to success. So you want to think about, first of all, you want to think about your equipment and how you're getting physically set up. So make sure if you're using Zoom or another online modality, you've practiced all the different buttons. You know what everything does, what everything means, and that it's something your participants know how to do too. Make sure you know how to record, that your microphones work. And as much as, with technology, inevitably there's some challenges here and there on the day of, but you need to make sure that you've at least test run everything and that you've got the troubleshooting skills in place. So if something's not working, have you tried different ways to fix it in the past? Are you ready to go? Um, I've had interviews where the tech hasn't worked and the like sustained has not worked, and it's really compromised the interview quality just because the participant gets completely pulled out of what's going on in order to try and accommodate for those challenges. So it's really important to test run with whatever form you're using ahead of time. You also need to make sure you, as the interviewer, are in a private place. You maybe need to have headphones on so nobody else can hear what's being said. If a participant chooses to talk to you from, say, a coffee shop on a laptop or something, that's their prerogative. They can make that choice because they can choose if they're in a public space, how much or how little they want to share. But for you, you have to make sure that you are protecting participants' identity and information at all times. So you don't want somebody to be able to look over your shoulder um, and see the face of the person that you're interviewing. You don't want to have somebody overhear anything. And you want to make sure you're not going to get interrupted unless, occasionally things happen. We're all human, but you need to set up your context as much as possible. You probably also want to either blur your background or make sure your background is a like kind of neutral professional setting. You don't want anything in your background that's going to be distracting for a participant. It's also important as you're getting ready to do this, especially for people like myself who are nurses or come from a background where we do maybe social work or we do therapeutic interviewing, that this is not a therapeutic space. So you are not there to create a therapeutic relationship. You do want to create a relationship with your participant, but at the end of the day, your goal is to learn more about a phenomenon and essentially extract information from someone. So you're not there to do counseling or provide kind of supportive feedback. Now, there is a balance here. Some people in the past have said that when you're interviewing, you should be a completely blank slate. Personally, I find that incredibly unnerving and it makes me very uncomfortable. So it is, in my view, it is acceptable to when you're interviewing someone, you can like nod or acknowledge what they're saying, laugh if something is funny. Um, and there are times where someone has shared something with me And I've said, okay, just, interview notwithstanding, I want you to know that I'm really sorry that that happened to you. And so I think it is important to respond as a human and show that empathy, but also you have the responsibility of making sure you never slide into potentially therapeutic territory. So if you find that you want to offer advice or check on this person or make sure they're okay, you need to talk to the primary investigator or refer the person to another service or something. That's not your role. So that's a challenge I often see is that when I read transcripts that nurses have done, they kind of veer into therapeutic territory. So just a reminder that while this is supposed to be a supportive time, it's not a therapeutic relationship. You need to get consent, and it's important. Maybe somebody has already signed a consent form, but it's still important at the beginning of the interview to go through and say, I know you signed a consent form, but can you please confirm that you understand what the study is about? Do you have any questions? And make sure this is the idea of consent as praxis, not just consent as the piece of paper has been signed. So take some time to talk with somebody and reassure them about the data protection that you have in place, just to make sure that they're comfortable with everything. You also need to make sure that you practice, not only with the technology, but you also need to practice your interviewing skills because it's a skill that you don't always organically create in your daily life. So it's something that you need to like deliberately spend time practicing. And so how I suggest you do that is find people, whether it's other people in your lab or uh, friends. I wouldn't necessarily say somebody you're really close with, like a partner or a parent, but like find somebody and go through questions with them. It might not be exactly what your interview questions are. For example, if you're asking somebody about nursing and they're not a nurse, you might make the questions more broad. But you need to sit down with somebody and talk to them for half an hour where you ask questions and they respond. It takes practice to not slip into oh, I know about that. I had this experience. And, it's not a reciprocal kind of conversation like you'd have naturally. So it's something that's important to practice. So, for example, I have an interview guide that's specific to a group of firefighters. I want to practice with somebody who's not a firefighter. So instead of asking them questions about firefighting, I might just say, hey, friend, I want to run through this with you and just see how it goes. We're not going to record. This is not actual data collection. This is just for my benefit. And I'll ask you questions about your work in general rather than about firefighting. So you have to make sure, this is not you're not violating your ethics. This is not data collection, but just find somebody and have a chance to practice those dynamics in a conversation. It's less important what the questions are, and more important that you just get a chance to kind of go through the movements of that before you go to your first interview. So initially, I tend to start with demographic questions because those are easy. People generally know how to answer them. So you ask, okay, can you tell me your age? How do you identify your gender? How do you identify your race or ethnicity? And kind of go through those. And then generally have a question at the beginning, something like, tell me a bit about your career. How did you end up in the current role that you're in as a nurse? Or what interested you in being a firefighter? Why did you want to be a peer support worker? Something like that that gives the person an opportunity to start talking about the topic, bring those memories to the front of their mind. And this does a couple of things. It gives that both you and them a chance to calm down because this can be a little stressful or your nerves can run a little high. And it just kind of gets somebody talking. It builds a little bit of rapport. It builds a little comfort and relaxation. And then from there, you can get into your interview guide in more detail. You never want to start with sensitive questions. You need to work up to some of that kind of thing. Um, so yeah, give the person a chance to share something about the interview topic that they wouldn't have to think too hard to answer, and then from there, as you build that comfort, then you can get into subsequent questions in your interview guide. Now, the biggest mistake people make when they're doing research interviews is rigid adherence to the interview guide. And now you have to be careful here because you do need to follow the interview guide. You have ethical approval for that. That's what you're trying to do. You can't just, start talking about complete different things. But in my view, the most important part of interviewing and being an effective interviewer is reciprocity with the participant, and you want to go where the participant wants to go. So maybe you have questions 1, 2, 3, 4. They start talking about something that's in question 3. So let them talk about question 3. And then if you can, work back around to topics from question 1 and 2, but let them lead the conversation and tell you, because they're the experts in their lives and in this phenomenon. You're there to learn. So if they think that talking about this piece is the most important and that's where they want to start, or they emphasize, question 3 instead of question 4, like go with that. Now, if somebody is truly talking about, I have to remember to buy milk on the way home today, and they've completely left behind um, their topic, you might need to steer them back and say, as much as I appreciate you that's something you're thinking about. Can we revisit this idea of and lead back to a question? But I find that people will, if you're really focused on like a rigid order or a rigid set of questions without any reciprocity for the participant, then you end up, they'll say something. What you really should do is prompt, and instead you kind of cut that off and ask something else. So go where the participant wants to go, as long as you're kind of within the space of the topic. And give them chances to talk about this. So, what does this look like when it works? And ask questions that reflect what that participant has said, not only what the next question is supposed to be on your interview guide. So if they've kind of deviated from maybe what the interview guide questions are, um, but they've said something really interesting, ask more about that. Don't worry about, oh, well, I have to ask question 2 and then question 3. So go where they want to go and respond to what they're saying by, okay, you've said that, that time off is really important to you. Tell me what that means. Is that time physically out of the building, or is it time where you're not thinking about your job? What is it about that time that's restorative? So you want to try and prompt as somebody is talking so that you can learn more. Um, if you're stuck, a great way to move forward is, can you give me an example of that? Or can you tell me what that looks like when it works or when it doesn't work? To get like a contrasting view of it. Or has it always been that way? Has that changed? So that can help kind of get a conversation moving a bit, is give me more examples or tell me different cases of, the example that the participants offered. Um, so let them drive, go where they want to go. And you can also acknowledge if they've kind of reached a conclusion to that idea and you do want to go back to a different question, use a transition phrase, something like, so changing gears a little bit or shifting topics slightly, I did want to go to this idea, or I'd like to come back to that point. Um, and so that you kind of signpost someone where you're going and you're not just asking questions out of the blue. You can also make notes while you're talking to someone, but you want to tell them ahead of time that you're going to do this so they know that if you're looking down and like what's going on, that you're still paying attention. In general, you want to keep the notes to a minimum. Sometimes I'll jot down like burnout because they'll say something and I think, okay, I want to keep hearing this story, but I think burnout is an important issue and we need to come back to that later. So I might just, because it's a lot to hold in your working memory. So I might just jot, okay, I need to talk about burnout, but let's focus on, they're telling me a story of education right now. So it's fine to do that kind of thing, but you should not be writing copious notes during interviews. That's what the recordings are for. And if you find you're doing that, you need to follow up on your technique, or maybe the interview guide needs modifications, or like something isn't quite going right there. Um, so go where they want to go. And sometimes you come to interviews later in the interview process, or maybe as a second, third stage of a mixed method study. So you've maybe already heard some ideas from prior participants and you want to learn more about that. So you can use techniques like saying things like, I've heard from other people that, switching shifts is really challenging or really problematic. Is that a problem for you? Is that something you've heard about? So that can be a good technique to build on ideas that you're already hearing about. However, I would say don't do that too early in the interview. Sometimes I've seen people, when they're on the 20th interview, they just jump straight to that. And you do want to give your participant a chance to organically bring up other things first. So ask them some questions about their experiences first, so that if they have something to contribute that you haven't heard before, you've got lots of space for them to say those things before you jump into kind of reinforcing or building onto previous findings. So you can say, I've heard a lot about this topic. What's your take on it? But give them a chance to share their original views first before you prompt them to follow up on something you've maybe heard before. Um, Otherwise, I think it's important to acknowledge the person in the interviews. Um, I have cried with the participant while they're talking because what they're talking about is really horrible, and like I was affected by it. Now, I did not lose control weeping, but I also didn't pretend that I was fine and that I wasn't affected at all. So it's fine to, have a few tears with your participant. It's fine to just allow for silence and take a moment and take a breath with that, because these are profound human experiences and you want to acknowledge that. So don't feel like you have to pretend, everything's okay. Um, and give them space for that. It's also, I've had novice interviewers also want to like fill the silence, especially around those more emotional moments. And I say, as much as possible, don't. Try and just focus on like take a deep breath, let that breath in, and give the participant a minute to collect their thoughts. Often they will start talking again when they're ready, but don't rush them off of something that is important. And so it's okay to be a little bit upset or to say, wow, that is I feel angry just hearing about that. I would be really upset too. That doesn't mean you have to agree with them and what they're saying, but it's important to acknowledge, that participants are often sharing very difficult things with you. You might also have cases where people say something shocking, and not necessarily shocking bad, but just shocking, or something that you are not prepared for or didn't expect you would hear. I've been doing interviews on regulation where I've heard, regulation of healthcare professionals on the surface, maybe a little dry. I've heard stories about assault. I've heard stories about all kinds of things in the mix of that. So it's important to anticipate that something like that might happen. In that moment, I mean, inevitably some of your response will register on your face. You want to try and you don't want to, but like, oh, I find generally, again, this is another case, take a breath. And it's okay to say, I need to think for a moment. I'm just not really sure what to ask you now, or I'm not sure how to move from that point. And you can go from there. Now, often, if somebody says something really shocking, it might be something you need to follow up after the fact. So, as much as we have confidentiality, there are limits. If someone's at risk of harm for self, others, or children, you do need to follow up on that. Or in some cases, I've heard about a practice at a facility that is really unsafe. And so, as a nurse, I have an ethical responsibility to the patients in that facility that I need to do something about that. Don't try and problem solve that in the moment of the interview. Those are discussions you have later, and that's problem solving you do later. Another challenge is sometimes you can have somebody say something really that you find personally very offensive. So while it's not okay for somebody to be using slurs or that sort of thing, you might have somebody say, well, I'm tired of all this gender crap, and there's men and women, and that's the end of it. That might not be a view that you share, and maybe you feel strongly that that is not a helpful view in our modern world. Um, in that moment, I find that it can be useful to take a breath and focus on what can I learn from why this person feels this way, rather than, oh my God, what's wrong with you? That particular view is from dinosaur times and get with the program of whatever kind. So this is where you kind of want to remember I'm here to be curious and I'm here to learn. And if you can learn more about why this person feels that way, or what experiences they've had, or what exposure or not exposure they've had that leads them to that view, then that's maybe a more useful finding than if you kind of interrogate them on like what's wrong with you. But just be aware that participants might have views that you're strongly against or something like that, and to be mindful that that can come up, and you need to think about calibrating your response so that you can continue the interview and keep moving forward. Now, it's never acceptable if somebody's berating you or saying things that are blatantly offensive. Like, you can always just click end and leave the interview. Nobody has to sit through those kinds of listening to those kinds of things, especially if it's not related to your interview topic. That said, be prepared for unexpected comments or ideas, and then those are the kinds of things you want to debrief after the fact with whoever's in charge of the study. Otherwise, just give people a chance. They'll tell you really incredible stories. If somebody is really, really going on, it is okay to say, I'm mindful of the time. I know that you've given me a lot to think about today, and I think we might have to wind up. Is there any final point you want to make? Generally, I try and like let people talk as much as they want to talk. I don't want to cut them off from sharing their experience. But I did have an interview that at 2.5 hours, I had to say, like, my bladder is going to burst and my head is so full of information and I can't possibly think of anything else. We have to call it a day. So if somebody does have a lot more and it's just like a logistical issue, you can always say, hey, do you want to have a follow-up? We can chat more next week. So you can use those kind of techniques. So you never want to cut somebody off, but you can round out the end of the conversation and say, "Oh yeah, I'm noticing, we've had an hour, and I know that you're at work today. Is Before we end, is there any final point that you wanted to share or something like that?" So, um, also plan to have some time after the interview. I generally tell people never do more than one interview in a day unless that's like the only time the participant is available. and allow at least a half hour between when you think the interview will end and the next commitment you have. Because some of the things people share with you, even if they're not really graphic, like there's weight to it, it affects you. And I find after I often need to just go for a walk and think about what I've heard, but also kind of prepare myself for the next part of my day. It's not something that you can just flip the switch off and keep going. So when you're doing interviews, make sure you've got some space time-wise on either side so that you can process what you've heard, make some notes, and go from there. So these are some general strategies that I find that will help set you up for success. You can also like know when to call it. I've had an interview where I don't know what this person's deal was, but there was nothing I could say or do that was going to build rapport. And they were giving me like one word answers, and I'd say, "Oh, okay, well, does this relate to this?" And they'd say, like, "No, how could you be so stupid to think those things are connected? This is what's going on." And I was just not getting anywhere with this person. I could have had a better conversation with a brick wall. And, at this point, I was an experienced interviewer and I was trying lots of different techniques and nothing was going anywhere. So I thought, you know what? I'm sure this is not a good experience for this person. I think they think my head is full of air or something, but they are just not or maybe it has nothing to do with me. They were having a bad day and they didn't want to cancel, but here we are. So I think I called that one at about 18 minutes, which is pretty short for most of the topics I cover. But you know what? We weren't getting anywhere. And I felt really uncomfortable, and I had tried some troubleshooting during the interview, and it was just not working. And so don't waste your time, don't waste their time. If it's really not, say, you can, even if you've only asked 2 of 5 questions, if it's like pulling teeth or you can't get anywhere or there's some kind of tension you can't account for, just say, okay, that's all my questions. Thank you so much. And, we'll follow up with a gift card if that's part of what you're doing with your protocol. So, but just call it. Don't belabor the point if you're not getting anywhere. Hopefully, you'll have enough other participants that you can have those kinds of discussions. I've also had people that have signed up for studies, and then once we start talking, like actually they really don't meet the inclusion criteria, or they're not in the right place to share, or something's going on. And those are also ones where, I mean, I would always, if I've offered a gift card, I always give them a gift card, but sometimes it's just a question of, you have an experience here, but it was 20 years ago, and that's not really what we're looking for. So rather than say that to the participant, I just wind it up and thank them for their time and go from there. At the end, you do always want to give the person, is there an opportunity to say, is there anything I haven't asked you that's relevant that you want to talk about? And then also to say, thank you very much for sharing these experiences with me. I appreciate you taking time to tell me about this slice of your life. You also want to consider that, do I need to remind this person, by the way, there is confidential free mental health support available for you. By the way, do you know that these resources are available? I want to signpost you to them, that kind of thing. I have had people become clearly emotional during interviews. I've never had somebody, we always have to put in our ethics forms, like the person becomes distressed, we'll offer to stop. I've never had somebody reach even close to that point. And I think if somebody was truly that sensitive or that distressed about the topic, they wouldn't volunteer to talk to you about it for an hour. So almost always people may have strong emotions, but they want to tell you things. Uh, they want to share. That's why they've signed up. That's why they've gone through the emails and the rigmarole and the consent form and everything else. So don't rush to shut someone down and say, oh my gosh, you're crying. Okay, we have to stop. Like, give them the space, let them make those choices. Um, if somebody did become like unmanageably emotional, then I would say don't ask them if they want to stop. Like you might say, you know what, this isn't, we're no longer able to learn from you. Don't say it out loud, but we're not learning from you right now, and this is obviously very upsetting, and we need to do something different. There's different tolerances for those kinds of things depending on what topic you're working on. And, some topics are extremely sensitive, others are not. So, there's flexibility there, but I have never had to stop an interview because the participant was overwhelmed and couldn't continue. They're there because they want you to know things. So generally, you have a really good conversation and lots of great ideas that can come forward. And in a perfect world, the person feels good after because they were heard and they had a chance to say things and somebody listened and somebody cared. And even if we can't fix whatever's going on that we're interviewing about, the opportunity to help someone feel heard and seen and listened to can have benefit in and of itself. So aim for that as you're going through and know that not every interview is going to go really well. Sometimes you find that the questions aren't written well. Maybe you need to slightly change the wording or look at an amendment to the questions to make them more understandable for your participants. And sometimes it's just some interviews go better than others, and that's okay. So, as long as at the end of the day you feel like you maintained the professionalism and the boundaries you needed to, and you gave a person a chance to be heard, then you're set up for success. So go forth and conduct research interviews.